We're going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully some other people will come back from break, but stay on time. We're going to close out our session with 4 talks on kind of lessons learned and challenges and opportunities moving forward. We're going to start out with Melissa Dickard from the BLM's National Operations Center in Denver, where she oversees the BLM's Riparian Program and the BLM's Assessment, Inventory, and Monitoring Program, and helps keep us all on the straight and narrow. And I believe she's going to talk to us about Lentic monitoring protocol efforts that the Bureau has embarked upon. So, Melissa?
Yep. Thanks, Scott. I'll start off by telling you that there is no data in my presentation at all. So that'll either make you happy or sad. So you're welcome, or I apologize. I'm going to be talking about we're in the process of putting this together, and we're making really good progress. So I'm pretty excited to share with you what we have so far in terms of approaching Lentic monitoring. And just to be clear on terms, by Lentic, we've kind of gone back and forth on the most appropriate term, but we did decide to stick with Lentic. What we mean by that is areas that are dominated by or water-dominated ecosystems, so they're really dependent on water, but where we're at least away from like a scour channel where the main driver of the system is the energy of the stream. So it does include floodplains, wet meadows, things like that, and your more typical wetlands.
Yeah, well, sorry. I would have really appreciated
So it's kind of fun to talk to people, and they say, oh, what do you do? And I say, oh, I do riparian work for the BLM, and they kind of go, oh. And then I usually say, okay, do you know what the BLM is? And they don't. And I say, well, it's kind of like the Forest Service, but instead of trees, we have sagebrush. And then they say, okay, well, what's riparian? And I say, well, you know how it's all brown, and then there's like this green stripe out there that's a stream or a spring or something? They say, yeah. And I say, okay, well, I work on that. And that's kind of how I explain it to people. So, you know, even though we tend to think of the sagebrush-dominated landscapes, BLM has a really rich diversity of these lentic sites, everything from sloughs, ponds, stock ponds, wet meadows, and some of my favorites are the fens, also the hill slope springs that you see over there on the left. Besides, wetlands are just cool, and I wanted to point out that if you've never been out on a fen and done this, you really should, because where else do you get to jump up and down and have the ground literally move underneath your feet?
Drove in on ramps, but most of the time they suck because there's no tie-off points.
Also, when you're in an arid ecosystem, wherever you have water, it's definitely an attractant. Whether you're a person out hiking, wildlife species of various kinds, or one of my friends that has been doing some work out here said they think of cows as a wetland indicator species, because if you want to find out where the water is, you just look out across and figure out where the cows are congregating.
I mean, I was just going to hang on to it and have it, you know, have 3 of them.
So when we start looking at monitoring these systems, we started out with the National Aquatic Monitoring Framework, and I recognize that in the title it says indicators for lotic. It's the indicators for the lotic systems, but the framework is applicable for all of these water-dominated ecosystems. And so that's kind of where we started, just kind of laying out, you know, how do you figure out core indicators? What are the processes you go through to put together a monitoring protocol? And so we were looking at multiple scales, both in terms of spatial scale, and then I wanted to point out that also to accommodate different kinds of sampling designs. So as we've seen with all of the talks today, we've had some great examples of everything from probabilistic sampling to more of a representative sampling approach, down to targeted sampling. And so we wanted to come up with a protocol that would be applicable for within all of those scenarios. Using core indicators and sampling methodologies, and then also with an eye towards standardizing the analyses that you would use for condition and trend determinations. So specifically our goal was ascertaining condition and trend at the various spatial scales, and again developed for Lentic and music systems. I want to point out that we've had tremendous help from the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, Joanna Lemley, and other folks putting together the justification and the protocol. they have really helped us out quite a lot, and I appreciate that. So for our target population, we decided to take a pretty broad approach and look at something that we could really fit across all these types of ecosystems. If you look at the types of lentic areas that are monitored with some other protocols, they tend to focus in, maybe specifically on groundwater dependent ecosystems or on, a kind of a more specific subset, but we wanted to be able to approach all of these ecosystems. We are focused on freshwater ecosystems, although we had someone ask, couldn't you use these in estuarine systems? We just haven't really looked at that or tested it, but I think you could probably do it with some testing. Where we have perennial vegetation, you'll see that we have a lot of indicators that are tied to vegetation. You kind of have to have a minimum site just to make sure you don't have your points auto-correlated, and where you don't have deep standing water. If you have little pockets of it, that's fine, but it shouldn't be across the site. There are other protocols that are better suited for that. So the overall process, again, from that framework is looking at monitoring questions and then going through a process of screening potential indicators. So we brainstormed all the indicators we could think of, pulled them from other protocols, looked at the literature, and then kind of went through them to screen them make sure they were relevant to what we're looking at, our monitoring questions, that we could separate out signal to noise, that they would be easily interpretable and usable. This is management of public lands, and so you shouldn't have to have a PhD to be able to understand what we're working on, and that they would be easily implemented. The guidelines we had for ourselves is that a crew of a couple people could go out and do a site in a day, kind of along the same lines as the other AIM protocols. And so we did this process with a pool of experts, and we'll continue to seek input as we go forward. We have a couple rounds of review coming, and I'm hoping that some of the folks in this room will give us some good insight, so watch for an email from me.
Yeah.
I want to acknowledge, too, that we made a conscious effort to link up the monitoring with our proper functioning condition assessment. People tend to be more familiar with the PFC protocol for Loadic systems, but we do the Lentic protocol as well. And we're just beginning to work on some revisions to this protocol. But the idea was that PFC is one incredibly valuable tool. It helps prioritize sites for monitoring. It can help you think through causation. It's a wonderful communication tool. It's a great way to kind of synthesize information. And monitoring is another good tool. We wanted to make sure that they formed a cohesive package once we get done. So anytime you start trying to tease apart the pieces of an ecosystem, you start with developing a conceptual model, looking at the key ecosystem processes and ecosystem attributes. I have to admit that those get a little bit spaghetti to me, and I like to look at it a little bit more simply. So you may have heard other folks talk about the idea of like a three-legged stool for aquatic ecosystems coming about from vegetation, soil, or landform, and hydrology. The reason it's helpful to kind of talk through these is if you start thinking about monitoring and those criteria that we put up before, soils are incredibly important to wetland ecosystems, and there's a lot you can find out from looking at the soils. But to really do any kind of, really good job of quantifying them, they can change pretty quickly across the landscape. Anybody that's done any kind of jurisdictional delineation, you can do a lot and a lot and a lot of soil pits, and that wasn't the direction we wanted to go. It didn't really meet our needs for feasibility. Also, hydrology is incredibly important, but a little bit difficult to really monitor. There's some really great methods out there looking at groundwater wells, piezometer arrays, but if that's the level of information you want, that's a little bit more involved. And so that kind of leads us to focus on vegetation. The great thing about that, too, is that if you think about it, it winds up being sort of a surrogate for the other indicators, that your soil and your hydrology will wind up being expressed in your vegetation. And so that kind of made us feel better about having to focus on sort of one leg of that stool, if you will. So the indicators that we've come up with are vegetative cover and composition, height, some information about woody species in terms of density and age class, We have, we're looking at hummocking. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then some basic water quality. As I mentioned, we'll be using some of these covariates in terms of soils, hydrology, looking at some of the landscape characteristics like classification of the wetland. Is it a hill slope versus a slough versus a fen, for example, and land use. And then one thing that's unique about this particular AIM protocol is we did decide to include those use-based indicators right in the protocol. They're supplemental indicators. If there's not a use that you're interested in that these match well with, then you don't need to collect this information. But, so, you know, we've seen in some of the other talks that having that annual use information collected at the same time and at the same location can be really informative, especially if you see any problems with your condition. It might help tease out causation. You know, certainly there are timing issues that you need to be aware of. You may want to collect these at a different time or do repeated measures, but we did want to make sure that data collection is happening in a consistent way as well. So one thing that gave us quite a bit of challenge is trying to come up with a way to lay out plots. These are all different sizes and all different shapes, and we kind of went round and round on this. And what we finally came down to is really just looking at it as a geometry exercise, and how do you best distribute sample points across different layouts. And so this is true even if you have, you know, maybe you have a large wetland and you want to do some subsampling within it. You can either take the standard plot, or maybe you wind up with an area that's of particular interest and, you know, it fits one of these other shapes. So you're just kind of laying out the plots based on shape. The protocol itself, we committed to incorporate existing efforts wherever it was possible. And so this is kind of a combination of the line point intercept data from Upland AIM, and then pulled some indicators pretty much straight out of BLM's multiple indicator monitoring protocol, which is a protocol that looks at riparian vegetation and many other things along stream banks. And so we knew that some people out in the field would already have that data or already be familiar with that, and so we tried to match that up. We are trying to look at hummocking. I think this is one that we haven't quite landed the plane on yet. We've got a couple different methods that we want to look at as we do some more testing. But basically, conceptually, we're looking at, are they more or less vegetated? Looking at things like angle, which can sort of tell you how recent the hummocking occurred. So do they have really steep sides like the lower left picture, or are they starting to heel over? I think one other thing that we're collecting is as you go along and do the line point intercept, we're also noting whether that point is falling on a high spot or a low spot, because I think that it could be really informative if you find out that all of your bare ground is in these low spots. That's a good indicator that you've got a problem in your lentic area, because it leads to drying of the lentic area as the water sort of flows out of the system that way. As Mary Manning likes to say, the sponge becomes a pipe. As far as next steps, as I mentioned, we are pulling the protocol together right now. We're hoping to have our first draft of it done in the next couple of weeks. And we'll send that out to a kind of restricted review group to get some input from people that we've had a lot of really good contributions on this effort going back over the last several years. And so we want to make sure that we're consistent with the discussions that we were having early on. We're hoping to do some testing of the methods this summer. We'd like to look at sample sufficiency and change detection, among other things. And then we'll go through some additional review. We need a good scientific review and an agency review. And then we'll be able to finalize the methods and hopefully have a protocol out next spring. As far as some of the challenges we have, determining condition can be difficult, especially where you have a real lack of ecological site descriptions. You know, those are kind of just getting started. There are a few out there. It can be pretty hard to find reference sites. Even things that are fenced a lot of times haven't been fenced for very long. But we do have some promising information coming from some vegetative indices. Those are pretty commonly used among the heritage programs who have a lot of good background in wetlands monitoring, and so that looks good. One other big challenge is trying to come up with a known sample frame. We have some mapping done, but it definitely focuses more on the larger wetlands. And my personal opinion is that if you're in a BLM field office and you have a wetland the size of a football field or bigger, you probably already know where it is, and odds are that you're doing some sort of management of it already. But these smaller wetlands are ecologically really important for, especially for species like sage grouse. And we don't always know where they are, and if we don't know where they are, we're probably not managing for them specifically. Also, we've got some limitations in terms of funding and capacity. At this point, with the funding and the capacity I have available to me currently, getting the protocol done is really about as far as I can take it right now, or as far as we can take it right now. But we're hoping that some opportunities present themselves that will let us move on to that testing phase and building the database and putting together the trainings to support it.
We didn't go to California.
Just a last quick note, we are getting started on the mapping. We have a partnership with St. Mary's University that's mapping lentic areas down to the 10th of an acre. They use a computer program that divides the landscape up into polygons, and then they pick out which polygons they think are lentic and do some field verification.
Check with you.
And with that, I just want to thank all the folks that have been involved in this. It's definitely been a group effort. Folks here at the National Operations Center, Mark Gonzalez and Steve Smith from the National Riparian Service team, Mary Manning from the Forest Service, and Jason Carl with the University of Idaho. So with that, I think we've got a couple minutes for questions.
Do you see the protocols being potentially adaptable after rolling out, like adding in new methods or what? How quickly could those be implemented?
That's a good question. We try to use in AIM this kind of idea of an 80-20 rule. And so if there are things that we see utility of adding that are pretty widely applicable, that's something that we could look into adding. If it's more of a kind of a specialized thing or just applies to a certain type of system, those would be great supplemental indicators that you could collect on your own in addition to the core indicators. Oh.
Yeah, I
The fresh take.
That's only for people that manage.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
One more quick question.
You mentioned the Lentic PFC.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also, did I hear correctly, an update of that? And I'm thinking about potential for Lentic, this is PFC, and then that intersection, where we find people as practitioners with PFC, that concept.
Mm-hmm.
We can tell, whether we're reaching a threshold or not.
Mm-hmm.
Thoughts about anytime, and where the possibility.
Of tying Lentic PFC to the monitoring or tying it up into creating ESD?
Either.
I think they all work in synergy, and we're trying to kind of keep our fingers in all of those pies. If you've been to very many of the talks over the course of the week, I've been really shocked how many of them have focused on these areas, and I think that it is kind of the next frontier of our monitoring science.
Specifically, then, are you anticipating an update?
And I know Logan.
Yeah, we've initiated it. It'll probably be a while in coming, but we're just getting started on it and clarifying some things.